everyone, it's Jack, joined by Dave here. We've been open since 1946, and we like to think we know a thing or two about modern railways, and the real railways as well. So I think it's time we start giving you some of that information. One question we always get asked is about the era system. So people always want to know what ran where and when, what each era is all about, and which one is best for their, well, when they get started with the first layout, which they should start with. So let's talk a little bit about that today.
Let's explain the era system.
So let's start with the obvious question. Why do we need an era system?
Well, Britain's railways have been around for over 200 years now, and throughout that time there have been lots and lots of different operators, companies, locomotives in use, liveries, you name it. It's just been a changing scene every year, even every month in some cases.
That's true.
And to keep track of that, so much history is pretty tough, especially for modellers who want to run things that look the same, operated in the same part of the country and in the same time scale. So the era system really helps with that. You can categorise each model that's released to say this is suitable to run with this locomotive or this coach. And it really helps modellers, beginners and experts understand the history of railways and incorporate it onto their layouts.
So it enables you to go, oh, I want to model Liverpool in 1994. I need X products. I can just click on this one area. That's for me.
That's it. It really helps you create that slice of the past that you envisage as your favourite part of history.
Okay, I think we need to start with Genesis, really, don't we? So Era 1 is what we call the pioneering era, and that covers basically the start of railways in Britain from 1804 right up to 1874. And that covers stuff like, you know, the most famous locomotive, well, probably one of the most famous locomotives ever made, the Rocket, between Liverpool and Manchester, and all sorts of very early passenger workings and freight that was starting off across the country.
Yeah, this really is the Victorian era we're covering here. This is the birth of Britain's railway network for freight and passenger use. As he said, this is Stephenson's Rocket with the first intercity railway between Liverpool and Manchester. Got things like Richard Trevithick's loco in there as well. And it really is a lot of the time where the railways completely covered the country. New designs were being built every year and a huge amount of technological advancement in there as well.
I mean, this really was a time of heavy competition, wasn't it? Yes. So there was all sorts of companies springing up all over the place, fighting over different lines and really pushing the envelope with different locomotive designs.
There was a huge rivalry at this point between a lot of companies, everyone trying to get on what they called railway mania, especially in the 1840s. Suddenly there was this big profitable scheme that everyone could build a railway and start transporting passengers, livestock, goods, coal, far faster than a horse and cart or a stagecoach. And
no one had ever seen anything like it, really. Like, it was scary speeds back then.
That's it, and everyone really wanted to get in on that. So it is a great point for locomotives in pretty much every colour scheme of every design. And being honest, with it being that pioneering and the designs changing that much, there's not a lot of it available to buy, really. It's not something that's been majorly produced. But there are quite a few modellers of that gauge out there. So if you are interested in becoming an Era 1 modeller, do look at what we have available and also search for some of those modellers as well, as they have some really iconic layouts covering those first days of railways.
Right, so we got the very start out of the way. So where do we go next?
Well, we go on to Era 2, and this is from 1875 until 1923. And this is what's called the pre-grouping era. Now, we'll come back to what the grouping means later, so hang on for that one. But in the meantime, this is where the companies really start to come together. We've still got a lot of independent operators out there, but they're really beginning to get their act together now. And coming together with a lot of similar designs, a lot of higher speed operations. So you start to see a lot more express locomotives in this time. And this is one of the golden ages of steam. A lot of really, really nice Victorian and Edwardian designed locos coming through in exquisite liveries, such as the Terrier in southeastern Chatham livery there. Lining, brass, polished parts, etc. really were the icons of the age at this point.
I mean, in a way, it really was sort of the best of both worlds, wasn't it? Because you still had a lot of competition there, all sorts of wacky liveries and different companies on the go. But it started to formulate into a bit of more of a proper network, didn't it? And stuff started to amalgamate properly.
These were railway companies now. They weren't just someone who'd set up a train and a couple of bits of track to make a quick buck, so to speak. These were the people who were operating commuter services, heavy freight flows, that sort of thing, designing express locomotives, tank engines, coaches, having their own workshops, having their own track laying departments. These really were coming into covering all bases themselves.
It really was one of the biggest industries of its day, and it has remained so ever since.
While we're on the subject of the biggest, this is one of the biggest growth areas in model railways too. There's a lot of companies and designers bringing out locomotives in pre-grouping styles and liveries now. I think really people have got the bug of those exquisite liveries, different stories, different operators. There's some really, really nice models coming out with a lot of extra details on them. So pre-grouping really is something to take a look at if you fancy something with a bit of class.
Yeah.
Really.
I mean, you just look at a locomotive like this with just the extreme intricate lining on it.
Absolutely.
It's colour schemes you'd never see in any other era, and there's so much variation, isn't there? So it's just a much more interesting point of history for a lot of people to look at.
That's it. The Victorians and Edwardians had really started to make a statement with railways to attract sort of first, second and third class passengers to them, and the models are really starting to replicate that.
Well, it was as soon as he realised there was money to be made.
That's it.
Right, so that was Era 2. Now we move on to Era 3. And we said before that we come back to the grouping. So this is all about the Big Four, which is when all the companies during Era 2 grouped together into just four. So basically, during World War I, the Railway Operating Division took over control of all the railways in the country. Yes. And following that, due to financial restrictions and also down to the complications of so many companies that were running in the country during Era 2, everything was brought into four different sectors, if you like, and that was four different companies. So you had the GWR, the Great Western Railway, the London and North Eastern Railway, London, Midland and Scottish Railway, and Southern Railway. And there remained to be rivalries between these companies, even though it was a much smaller field of play with fewer companies in existence. The most fiercest was probably between the LMS and the LEDR, wasn't it?
It really was.
That resulted in some of the most iconic locomotives of all time, which were designed purely to capture the sort of exuberance and excitement of the railways during that period, and to basically force each other to just keep getting better and better. So you had the likes of the Flying Scotsman, Mallard, Princess Coronation class. It really was like a massive period of advancement, wasn't it?
This really was where the development happened. I mean, Era 3 runs from 1923 until 1947, so you've got only quite a short lifespan.
It's a very short window, really, isn't it?
But this is where the real development happened. As you said before, there was a lot of rivalry, especially between the London Midland and Scottish and the London North Eastern, where it was basically which train can get you to Scotland from London the fastest and in the best sort of condition, the most luxurious trains. There was a lot of similar things happening in Germany, across Europe and across the world at this time, really. So Britain bought that bug, so to speak.
It really was a great train race, wasn't it?
A lot of words like Art Deco come into the design at this stage, a lot of streamlined locomotives. So this really was the case of style and sort of workhorses as well. These locos were meant to do the job as well as look good and attract people to the railways.
Yeah.
And some, as you said, some of the most iconic designs, the Flying Scotsman we've got in front of us, but also quite a few workhorses there. I mean, locomotives like the J36 at the front, thousands and thousands of freight locomotives painted black just went about the business, transporting coal, boxes, etc. Whatever you can think of at this point, it was moved by rail. Just started to get road transport in, but there was no big lorries, there was no sort of courier services out there. Rail transported freight and rail transported passengers. It was about to turn a little sour. This was the turning point, but this really was the time when style was involved in railways.
It really was. Like we've just said, there was so many locomotives during this period, and it was such an iconic era, and it's always been really well catered for in the modelling world as well. So, like we've already touched on, there's locomotives on this table from that period, but there's so much more in stock as well. And you can run anything from, your workhorse big black freight locomotive with, tens of wagons on the back of it, up to your glorious express passenger workings as well.
This is it. Whether you're modelling in N, double O, or even O gauge, there's something for you in the Era 3 network, really. Whether you're modelling LMS, GWR, Southern, or London North Eastern, there's a lot of high quality models really taking that era to heart at the moment, with some of the exquisite finishes that the real locos had themselves.
In a way, it's almost an easy era to get into, isn't it? Because there's so much information out there too.
And there's so much variety as well. There's locomotives in black, locomotives in all different colours under the rainbow, so it is really worth a look into. So, where does that take us? Era 4?
Certainly does.
Era 4. Right, this is the start of British Railways. This is from 1948 until 1956. And this is when those 4 companies became one, British Railways. This was formed after World War II. Again, the companies had cooperated during the war for the betterment of the country, and the government nationalised them at the end of 1947, with it all coming under one at 1948. You can still imagine though, you were talking tens of thousands of steam locomotives. You just started to get a couple of diesels on the scene at this point, but not too many. They weren't really in the mainstream.
A lot of these were the sort of experimental diesel classes, weren't they, from the big 4?
They were, but everyone's designs all came into one big melting pot, because those big 4 companies all had their own designers, all had their own coaches, works, ways of doing things, different signalling systems, and even right down to the core of their operation. And suddenly, you've put them all in one big pot, and you've got them all to play together. And
it really was one heck of an undertaking at the end of the day, wasn't it, of having to combine an entire country of railways into one system.
It was a government service by this point, really. It really was for the country rather than private companies making cash for themselves. And during the Era 4 point, you've still got a huge influence from those big 4 companies. Okay, the British Rail branding's out there, and a lot of new locomotives are being built, what's known as the standard designs, took the best of steam locomotive development from all the 4 of those companies and said, right, we're going to set up a selection of standard locomotive designs. Built about 10 different types, tank engines for freight and commuter duties, big express passenger locos, something for everyone. This was just as the steam era was coming to an end and diesels were coming in, though, so it was sort of the last sort of developments of steam. It really was the post-war. Quite a few new innovations were going in, things like roller bearings, etc., fitted to parts of them. But this was sort of steam's final development.
It was its last hurrah, really, wasn't it? And that's where you saw some of the really sort of most refined steam locomotives ever in that period.
And it's a great era to model, because you've not only got that really modern 1950s steam designs, but because you've inherited all that stuff from the big 4 companies, you've still got a lot of the Victorian locos. We spoke right back in Era 2, if you remember that part of the video. You've still got them working for British Railways. Okay, they're in a different colour, but there were some locos that were 70, 80, 90 years old working alongside these modern steam locomotives. So this has got to be the era, really, where if you want an old-fashioned locomotive but a right up-to-date 1950s design steam loco, and even a couple of diesels, this is the one for you. And there's still quite a lot of that colour variety in there as well. A lot of it was black, I'm not going to lie, the standard colour was black. But you've still got British Rail Blue, you've still got British Rail Green, as you can see on the Flying Scotsman here, and quite a few of the locos kept the old liveries because you had to repaint 10,000 steam locos.
Well, that's it. It's what's the point of doing it if it's not going to be cost effective to do so?
So it took them quite a few years to change over. So again, this is a great era not only for sort of running different locos together, but if you're not quite sure whether you want to do the big 4 or British Rail, you've kind of got a crossover point. You can say, well, I'll have that loco in LMS livery, I'll have that locomotive in BR. So if you can't quite make your mind up on what to go for, this is the one for you.
It really is a point where you can run practically anything you want.
It is, yeah. Well, next up, this is one of your favourites, isn't it?
Not quite my favourite, but it's certainly a really interesting period of history.
Yes.
So we're up to number 5 now, and this is sort of British Railways Part 2. So we talked a lot about how British Railways came in and really started to standardise the operations and the locomotives that they had at their disposal, and this really was the dawn of the diesels. It wasn't quite the end for steam locomotives on the main line, but it really was sort of the death throes. So there was all sorts of experimental diesel classes that started to come in, and you still had your big, really refined beastie steam locomotives still running alongside them, stronger than ever. And like you said before, you still had some of these really sort of Victorian class of locos, some still just clinging about in there till the end.
There was a couple still managing to get in
still
there.
there.
Yeah.
So this was a period where if you really liked running both types of diesel and steam locomotives on your layout, this is the best way to justify it.
Well, this is the point where the British Transport Commission, basically the government, turned around and wanted a lot of investment in diesel locomotives, electric locomotives, modernising the railways. A lot of other countries had really got on board with electrification quite a bit of time before this. And I imagine they were a little jealous, to be quite honest.
Yeah, I'd imagine so. All of our neighbouring countries in Europe are practically...
This is it. Everyone had given it a go with high-speed express electric locomotives, etc. And BR essentially turned around to anyone who could put a locomotive together and said, can you build us a prototype design and we'll see if it's suitable. Hence you get locomotives by pretty much everyone at this point.
Yeah.
A lot of common names out there for diesel manufacturers such as English Electric, Sulzer. A lot of them built by British Rail as well in their own workshops, so they basically stopped making steam locomotives and changed over to diesels. And you can get quite a lot of wacky prototypes in there as well that don't last much longer than this. And the great thing is as well, they've pretty much all been covered in model form, even right down to the unusual one-off prototypes.
Absolutely.
So there's your conventional diesels, such as things like your Class 37 that had hundreds and hundreds of them made. Things that a lot of people will know, such as the Deltics with the Napier power units and the drone noise that they make, but really down to the quirky ones in there as well. All those diesels are covered in model form, so if you fancy something from there. But as he said, alongside that, you've got a lot of those steam locomotives in the final liveries they wore just before they were replaced by those diesels, running side by side. So if you want steam, but you also like your diesel, or you're a diesel fan, but you like a bit of steam, this has got to be the era for you.
That's it. I mean, in real life and in model form, it was something that was to behold, really, wasn't it?
Yes.
We nowhere would ever see that mixture of locomotives again, unless you went to a gala or a preserve railway.
That's it.
Okay, so now we're up to era 6, and this is the British Rail pre-TOPS era. This ran from 1967 to 71. And so again, it's another really short window, really, in the era system. And to be honest with you, I really don't know that much about this one. So I'm going to hand it over to you again.
Well, for such a short window, there's quite a lot of interesting stuff happening and a lot of changes going on. This is where the diesels take over. This is their moment now. This is where their chance to shine. There's a lot going on here, a lot of investment. And this is the last of steam on British Rail as well now. Last little pockets of it died off in 1968 in the northwest and northeast of England, so no more steam. Steam's gone. Now, you could have a couple of really manky looking freight locomotives, but your expresses had disappeared, that sort of thing, but that's steam finished. We've still got quite a lot of those quirky prototypes going around, but again, they're starting to fall by the wayside, and that standardisation's coming back. There's a lot of new things like carriage designs, how the track's built, etc., electrification projects, and they're really starting to get a grip on how diesels work and what types they need to go with in the future.
Well, that's one thing I do sort of know about this period is they started to try to move away from having loads of different types of diesel engines, didn't they? So in the era before, you had like diesel hydraulics, diesel mechanicals and stuff like that, and they tried to move away from non-standard kind of locomotives, didn't they?
This is it, and I mean, having those prototypes from eras 4 and 5 were a really good way to see what they needed to replace steam engines, but it left them with a bit of a legacy of locos that quite a lot of them weren't actually that good, and this was the time where they really sort of pulled away the bad stuff and left just the good locos to handle the services and really standardised on it. One of the main things that happens here as well is one of the liveries changes. So you've had your BR green, that's come with you. I mean, it's pretty much come from the Great Western Railway, really, that shade of green. So that's come right through from sort of the 1840s, 1850s. This green goes.
Yeah.
This is where it finishes. It's been around in some forms. I mean, you can say, some people say it does, some people say it doesn't come from Great Western into BR, but the shade's the same, the line is the same, so for me it carries on.
It's similar enough.
For me it carries on. But this is where it finishes. We go over to blue diesels, and a lot of blue is the colour now. Blue's the colour for the next few eras, and we're going to carry on looking at blue things for a while. But this is where we lose green. Right. So that's one of the main changes. So if you like green,
sorry,
the rest of the video is not for you. But if you like other colours, stick with us, and we'll go back to covering more different colours. But as for a modeller, again, this is something that's really coming to the fore at the moment because of all that sort of quirky changes and the amount of variety you can have there. A lot of experimental livery changes when we were swapping over to the blue, a lot of different designs. There was a lot of cases where even the same type of loco, two of them didn't look the same.
Well, there wasn't really a standard at that point, was there?
Exactly.
So there was quite a few locos that had their own sort of versions of BR Blue, and then there was some like the 86s that had electric blue and stuff like that, which is a totally different colour scheme. And
this is it. So it's not just a case of thinking, oh, well, diesels are coming in, there's no more imagination anymore. This is one of the most interesting parts of British Railways where they're just trying to get everything on the same page. And it's taken them a little while, so actually there's a lot of variety. And again, the models available really support that with the diesels and the sort of end of the steam era, steam locos, coaches and wagons that you can get.
Yeah.
Well, we're heading into the 1970s now, and appropriately, it's time for Era 7.
It's easy to remember. So this was a period where, like we just talked about in the last era, of where British Rail really started to try to get everything together under one system and have some real standardisation there. This is where they introduced what's called the TOP system, which is TOPS. And that's a computerised system and a numbering system for all the locomotives and rolling stock, everything. To have it all properly categorised so that you know exactly what was what.
I mean, before this, if you needed to find out where a wagon was on the system or another vehicle, for example, you pretty much had to follow its history through a piece of paper, and there's records of certain small goods vehicles going missing officially, and they had to go and search the yards to find them.
Well, wasn't it decades later they'd find stuff in sidings and stuff, and it just had no record?
It sounds like fantasy, but it actually happened quite often before this, and with the computer age coming in, it really was time for British Rail to, well, literally take stock of what stock they had. You know, and turn around and give everything its own computerised number, be able to find it on a system where it was. And it really helped revolutionise things like freight traffic, but also how they overhauled stock and how they worked on the maintenance, because they suddenly know how soon they needed to work on it, where it was, when they could get it back to a certain depot.
That's it.
So with that standardisation, this is where you start to get BR Blue.
Yeah. So this is the start of a development that goes on for quite some time, isn't it? And it started to be applied to everything. Yes. All sorts of diesels, all sorts of electrics, and rolling stock too. So obviously you've got your blue and grey coaches and all that kind of stuff. So it really was a period where everything just came together, and it's a fantastic place for modelers too, because if you like uniformity,
it really is the one for you. Yeah. But at the same time, there's still quite a bit of variety and development in there. There's a lot of different types of locomotive, different freight duties, but you almost kind of go back to some of the old eras, because quite a lot of money went into developing express designs, iconic designs. This is where you get the high-speed train.
Yeah.
And okay, you might think, okay, everything's blue, it's just diesels. But suddenly you've got a streamlined high-speed train again. It's like being back in one of the earlier eras.
Well, this is a point, again, where they tried to make the railways sexy for people.
Yeah.
It was the age of the train, after all. That's you know, it really was harkening back to the glory days of the Big Four, where they wanted to get everything, you know, they wanted people to get on trains. They wanted it to be popular.
Absolutely. So, and a lot of development and research, things like heavy freight locomotives came in here, what they called a merry-go-round coal service, where the coal trains wouldn't stop. Essentially, they went straight round in circles, unloading and loading.
Which revolutionised freight to this very day, hasn't it?
It did. You've got things like Freightliner services. This is where container traffic starts. So all the container trains you see now, this is where it began pretty much. So it's really starting to look like Britain's modern railways. It's starting to look like the railways you can see today, but you've still got a lot of that variety in there. And as you said before, whether you're modelling N gauge, O gauge, double O gauge, you can get those HSTs. You can get those coaches, the wagons, the locos. Exactly. So, and a lot of people can still remember this as well. It's still fresh in a lot of people's minds.
That's it.
And there's some really nice books and DVDs and photos out there.
And our own formation guides online as well, which can really help you with this sort of stuff. Okay, so British Rail has really got its stuff together now. Everything's standardised. So what really happens now if everything's so great?
Well, it all changes.
Oh, God.
We've got sectorisation now, and this is era 8. This is from 1983 until 1994. And BR is, as you said, BR spent ages getting a livery together, getting certain types together, and it's changing, essentially. We're going into different brands, different areas. And BR had really grown modern at this point and got a lot in its marketing side as well as the operations side, and continuing in that sort of age of the train and seeing the success with things like the high-speed train. They really wanted to create brands for each area. Yeah. So they started parcelling off different parts of the company. It was still operated by British Rail. It was still under one big operational umbrella. But a lot of sort of the local councils and sort of the big cities got involved in funding and helping the operations too.
Well, this is where they started to get into the mindset, which you can practically see in the modern day now, where they wanted to sectorise everything up and, like you say, devolve power to like local areas, but also on a bigger level of splitting it up into intercity sections and freight sections and stuff like that. So they wanted everything to kind of come under the umbrella but manage itself to make things run a bit more smoothly in their eyes.
It made railways a lot more identifiable with either the passengers or the freight customers, so to speak, rather than everything just being British Rail. Suddenly you've got rail freight, and then you've not only got rail freight, but you've got rail freight construction, rail freight coal, rail freight, etc., etc. You've got different brands.
And not just in the freight areas, but in the passenger sections too. And this is some of like the absolute cult favourite liveries of the British Rail era, isn't it?
This is where we hit things like ScotRail, Intercity, Network South East. These are the household names from that era, and a lot of them have carried through to today as well. Really iconic names out there. And of course the liveries to go with them as well. Some of the main liveries you'll see out there during this era is when the colour really started to come back. We're going away from blue now. We've got Intercity with black and the red stripe. We've got Network South East with the dark blue and red. We've got rail freight with grey. We've got black on rail freight. We've got
your Engineers Dutch with the yellow.
Engineers Dutch. We've got all that sort of stuff coming back through. And this is where it got really fun as well, because there's a lot of individual identity here. You'll see Jack mentioned before about some of the guides we've done, and one we've done is on the depot emblems and different things, and you'll see that this is a lot of area where each depot with locomotives got its own little emblem on it, whether it was the Stratford Sparrow, whether it was the Eastfield Scotty Dog. There was lots of different things that made locomotives individual, and it's great for modellers who just fancy putting those little bits of details on locos and tweaks and that sort of thing, making them their own, because pretty much every modeller or rail enthusiast that I spoke to who loves this era really has a favourite loco, and it is because of one of those little identifying things. So you can really personalise it down. And the great thing there as well is pretty much as we've found so far, if you're a modeller of this era, you've got it all on a plate.
Yeah.
You really, really have.
It really is an interesting point. There's such a diversification of liveries at that point, but everything looks like British Rail still. There's a bit of an umbrella to it. So it's if you look at a layout from that era, you know what you're looking at.
Yeah. So you thought things changed in era 8. Well, prepare yourselves for era 9.
Yeah, things got a bit crazy here. So love it or hate it, this is when the railways became privatised in the UK. So British Rail got overnight. Yeah. And essentially we've gone full circle and we're all the way back to basically like era 2 again. So you've got all sorts of companies who just just appeared from nowhere practically.
Yeah, you've suddenly ended up with quite a few different operators covering different parts of the country, all starting to build their own train designs again. And like you say, it's gone back to the Victorian times where it's pretty much every man for himself. Again, really, a lot of railway rivalry, a lot of people coming in to make money from it, etc. And it's gone back to how it was.
Yeah. So this era covers the sort of initial period of that. So, like you say, it was a period of great experimentation and change for the UK railways.
And that's
turbulent for a while, but things really started to piece together. I have to admit, it's my favourite era because I'm a 90s kid. So this is what I grew up with.
Well, it is 95 to 2004, isn't it?
That's the one. So, and you really start to see some of what I believe to be very iconic locomotives and rolling stock now, which is still running to this day. So a lot of these companies inherited what British Rail, well, they had to inherit what British Rail had. So case in point, likes of Virgin, they took on all of the Class 87s and the Mark II coaches and stuff like that, and they said, no, we need to have brand new stock. So that's where you start to see stuff like the Class 390 Pendolino coming in and the Class 220 and 221 Voyager units. And some of these are absolutely revolutionary and really incredible designs which have shaped the railways again.
This is it. A lot of these companies really wanted to sort of make their mark at this time and say, nope, new trains. And over 1,000 new trains were built in the first few years.
It's incredible.
These companies really wanted to go for it. And of course, a lot of different designs as well. So if you really like your modern stuff, but you love different colour schemes, you love different companies, this is a great era because you can still have some of those classics. You can still have your Class 37s, your Class 47s. They were still around, but you can really start to get to grips with some of these really modern, sleek 21st century trains as well. And they're all available. There's a lot available to buy.
And it's almost like we were talking about before in that a few eras ago it was dawn of the diesels and that sort of wiped out the steam era. It's not quite on the same level, but this was almost the dawn of the multiple unit. Yeah. So practically everything now is multiple units. And this all started in the initial privatisation era. You've still had plenty of locos out and about doing work on passenger and obviously on freight services. But a lot of the passenger stuff moved over to multiple units.
Yeah.
Well, if you're still hanging in with us, we're up to number 10 now. And this is Rebuilding of the Railways, which is 2005 to 2015.
Well, this is the one, those who've been watching the video all the way through have probably got the idea that things change and the railway takes a couple of years to get its act together.
Yeah.
Really?
It was a big shock to the system, wasn't it?
This is it again. This is the change to BR, this is the change to grouping. This is kind of it again now, where we've had a few years of privatisation. It's been a bit of a bun fight, to be honest. There's been a lot of different operators come in and go within those 10 years. And this is where people really start to settle down. This is where the companies that have been around for a couple of years now really start to cement in with the new fleets that they were getting in Era 9. There's still quite a few new developments coming in as well, but there's a huge amount of money going into Britain's railways at this time. This is your time when the high-speed rail link comes into London from the southeast coast. This is a lot of development across the country. And a lot of these operators are becoming more long-term now, so you're seeing new trains, new liveries really coming through, but quite a bit more of that standardisation creeping back in.
That's it.
Now everyone's got their feet under the table and understands what privatisation is. Start to become a lot more familiar with people, and a lot of the operators are really starting to get serious.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons we call this the rebuilding of the railways. It more means that after that kind of shock to the system of railways and everything kind of split apart for a while, everything started to really start to increase again. And we did actually start to see some lines and stations start to be reopened as well, which is still happening now. Not quite to the scale of things opening that might have happened, in history, but there was quite a few lines that kind of returned to service, which was very nice to see.
Yeah. And again, this is a great era for modelers of N-Gauge, 00 and O, because it's all available. You can still get those, whether you want the modern trains or you want some of the stuff that's still clinging on, things like the Class 37 coming through there. It's still available to buy, and you can still get that variety in liveries. But this is where those operators have really screwed down on the professional.
Well, this is where they really started to understand their brand identities and what their unique style was, and that's where you start to see some really, really nice liveries coming through, because they kind of knew what they wanted to do with it by this point, and that's where you get your stuff like your DRS and the newer Virgin livery and stuff like that. It's really nice.
This is it, and they were a lot more confident then, so they could really start to put their colours all over the place, and there's a lot more colours out there.
Yeah.
So, last but not least, we're up to now. It's Era 11.
Era 11 is what we are doing right now.
This is 2016 to, well, today and a little bit in the future.
So I think what we're planning for this era to be until 2026, but it could go any way at the moment. And we're in a very interesting point for the railways right now. It's almost, I think, once this era is finished, I don't even know what we're going to call this, are we? So we're almost back to a big four era in some ways, but because we've seen a lot of those identities returning. So you've got GWR back on the scene with some really classic sort of designs on their trains and the logos and stuff like that. You've got LNER come back on the East Coast Mainline express services.
London North Western Railway, South Western Railway. They're all these old names from the Victorian era, Era 3. All the eras are coming back. We've just covered them in the video, but they're coming back to us in real life now as well.
It's another one of those points in railway history where companies have wanted to give the railways some pizzazz and give people almost an emotional connection to the trains by having that historical identity there.
And there's a lot of new trains coming through as well. It harks back to the 1930s and the 1970s when the streamliners were coming through and the HSTs, because we have things like the Intercity Express, the Class 800s, that a heck of a lot of operators are using now. They're revolutionising express rail travel. A lot of new multiple units are coming through, and models are coming through with them as well as they are developed. But you've still got locomotives such as the Class 68 pulling trains out there. The last few sort of diesels from the 1960s are still around. You've got people like Colas Rail Freight using the 37 after 50 odd years.
You've still got 20s running about out there and 08s and all sorts of things.
So if you are sort of wanting to keep your finger on the pulse of the railway industry, you can still model it even though it's changing every day, because there's models coming out for it in all three of the major scales, so you can keep track of what's going on but keep your layout on track as well.
That's it. So I think we've covered everything we can there in just this one video. There's a lot more to say, but we wanted to give you a nice little rundown of what each era means. And alongside this video, we have tried to build some nice resources for you to help you on your modern railway journey as well. So we've got our formation guides on the website, which are coming out every so often about all different eras, and that shows you example trains from that period that you can put together and what models you need to buy to do it. We also have guides on specific locomotives that have come out, showing you all the different liveries you've worn and models of them that have been available. And we've also been trying to do other little bits and bobs. So like Dave mentioned earlier, we've got our emblems guide, which shows you all the different emblems from throughout railway history as much as we can, and depot emblems and stuff like that.
But that about wraps it up. And if there are any more questions, say so in the comments and let us know if you like this video, and do subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you again soon.
See you next time.